Hello and welcome to episode 79 and 80 US elections, geopolitics, and international relations, analyzing their impact on the space industry. We have previously discussed geopolitics and international relations as an independent topic, but with a little bit touch upon how it impacts the space industry. Today, we are going to take a deep dive into its impact and the way it affects the complete dynamics and the operations of the space industry. So, therefore, to take a deep dive into this subject, we have today with us Victoria Sampson from Secure World Foundation. Hi, Victoria. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi there. Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much, Victoria, for taking out precious time. I know, things are very much busy, and I think it's going to get a lot busier in the industry in the coming days from September. But yeah, I would like to take this moment to again appreciate to give us this precious time and provide these insights that we'll be talking today about. Before we take an actual jump into the topic and dissect the several aspect of geopolitics, international relations, the way US elections are coming, and how it's going to impact the complete space industry in terms of operations, finances, and all, can you briefly provide us an introduction about yourself? Basically, what is education background and how did you end up doing what you're doing at the moment?
Sure thing. Again, my name is Victoria Sampson. I'm the Chief Director of Space Security and Stability for the Secure World Foundation. The Secure World Foundation is a US-based nonprofit that focuses on the long-term sustainable use of outer space. We promote best practices and norms of behavior to make sure that space is accessible to and usable for all over the long term. So we're all space all the time. And to be honest, I am not a space person. A lot of people in the space industry grew up, looking to the stars and wishing they could be astronauts. Not me. I was always very interested in international relations, and so that's what I went to school in. I have a BA in political science with a specialization in international relations, and then I went to grad school and I have a master's in international economics and international relations. So zero scientific training, and actually even zero training on security issues. I was very interested in development when I was doing my studies. But the first job I got out of grad school was working for a defense contractor, scripting wargaming scenarios, what is now the Missile Defense Agency. So I had a lot to learn about, just the whole defense industry process. Learned a lot about ballistic missile defense. I learned about, ballistic missiles in general. But I was not a fan. And so after a couple of years, I switched over to arms control and I started working on anti-missile defense, nuclear proliferation, trying to reduce that, things of that nature. And space was an offshoot of missile defense. At the time when I was working for a think tank on this issue, it was looking like the United States was going to maybe do some research into space-based missile defense interceptors again. And so that's kind of how I got introduced back into space. And so when the Secure World Foundation wanted to really establish a DC presence for itself because its headquarters are in Colorado, they knew me from my work on space security issues. I'm looking at it from a missile defense perspective, and so they asked me if I wanted to apply for the job. I was like, no, I'm not a space person. Ugh. But I thought, okay, you know what? I was not living in DC at that point. I'm like, oh, I'll take the job. Should be interesting. I'll learn some new things. I'll do it for a year or two and refresh my contacts in DC and then go somewhere else. And that was 15 years ago. I am definitely deeply
Yeah.
entrenched in Secure World Foundation and in space issues in general. But I will say, for example, a lot of people in our organization, we look at space, how it can help life on this planet. So we're not, an organization that necessarily promotes space exploration, although, there are plenty of organizations that do that, nothing against that. But really, we're looking at, okay, how does it help people here on Earth?
Interesting. That's an inspiring journey, I would say, from the political science complete background, missile defense, nuclear side of the research, and then coming to the space industry. I believe it's a very inspiring journey. I'm now excited, towards the full fledged of the conversation deep dive that we'll be taking now. Actually coming to the prime point of the conversation for which we have organized this podcast. So, how US elections influence the country's space priorities, both in terms of space exploration programs as well as the military space programs.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to it's an interesting question because it both does and it does not affect US space programs, and which is kind of weird. You'd think like it would absolutely affect it. Um, I will point out, if you look at, kind of the guiding document for U.S. space, programs, budgetary decision making, that sort of thing, it's truly guided by the U.S. national space policy. Each presidential administration has done one, going back to the Carter administration, so back to the 70s. And if you look at them, they're by and large fairly consistent, which is unusual because we've had, Republicans and Democrats in office, very different types of presidents. But they're mostly consistent. There's maybe a change of emphasis as new technologies come on, or, new interests come on board. But by and large, mostly the same. I mean, there's a little bit of change also with arms control, how some presidents view arms control, in terms of space issues. So, and that makes sense because, the United States has, generally the interest it has in space and needs for space is pretty consistent as well. It's an important part of how the U.S. economy functions, how it's a key national security enabler. So it's, been a key part of our, international relations efforts, and a lot of our scientific research. So that's not going to change. But you do see, how it's carried out, and the devil is
Yes.
always in the details, right?
Yes.
So, for example, we had the Trump administration restarted the National Space Council, which hadn't been in effect for a couple administrations, and that was something that was intended to improve the interagency process. So there's more coordination within, the U.S. government in terms of how they approached various space topics and programs, and that was continued under the Biden administration. But you see, and again, since the time that I've been working on these space issues, you see presidential administrations flip flop between where we're going to go next. Is the United States going to go back to the moon? Are we going to go back to an asteroid? Are we going to go back to a moon? Are we still going to go back to the moon? When are you going to put people on the moon? That sort of thing. So that, emphasis changes as well. But I will point out, the military side of the conversation, I think that's probably where you see a little bit more of a difference. And again, the United States has had a continued interest in military space. This is not new. This has, been something, from the beginning of the space age. The reason why the United States got into space was because of geopolitical competition with the Soviet Union. So this
Yes.
is not a new thing. But I mean, you can argue, okay, well, how do you handle funding? What kind of priorities do you look at? And some of that is shaped by the president, and some of that is shaped just by, the geopolitical environment in which the United States is operating. For example, the Trump administration officially kicked off the United States Space Force, but that was something that had been talked about for decades as something that the United States needed to do because there was no military space organization in charge of its own priorities. Acquisition for military space was distributed, is kind of still is distributed across a bunch of different departments. And so there was an interest in kind of, centralizing that. So, and when the Biden administration came in, they opted to continue with the Space Force. And I think part of that also, is reliant upon the fact that the space environment has changed. It's more complicated, it's more congested. There is a proliferation of counter space capabilities. And you see this internationally. A lot of countries in the past 5, 7, 8 years have started their own military space organizations. Russia and China both did theirs in 2015 and
Yes.
2016. You had India do theirs in 2019, France in 2019,
Yes.
Japan started one in 2019. The UK and Australia started one in the past couple of years. And that's just an indication that national security space is important for many countries, and it's not just the United States. So there's some emphasis on that as well. And then there's always the
Yeah.
matter of, how much emphasis is put on it politically by the administration. Space, mostly in the United States, I would say, is nonpartisan, bipartisan. It's mostly
Yeah.
supported by both parties, so mostly. And so, generally speaking, it's not as political as some other topics. Generally, when we're talking civil space, sort of things. So I would say that there's a possibility for some change, particularly depending upon if, for example, Kamala Harris wins, who she would name to be, if she continues the National Space Council, which I think has been helpful in guiding topics through the interagency process within the U.S. government. But B, who would she name to be the head of that? Both Trump
Yeah.
and Biden named their vice president to be the head of the National Space Council. So in this case, it's, Kamala Harris right now. So it's possible she would name, um, Walls to be her VP. I'm sorry, the head of the National Space Council, but and that also affects interagency process and how effective they are for this sort of thing. But there's a lot of moving parts. So the U.S. president can guide a lot of this, both in terms of how much political power they wish to put in these sort of topics, and then who they name to be working on these topics, and what they urge funding to be. But we have our checks and balances, and we've got Congress is able to weigh in, and you've got the different departments doing this what they want as well. So it's a whole government approach that is shaped by the U.S. presidential administration, but it's not going to be like, well, a president's in charge, suddenly space is going to be getting trillions of dollars of funding. That's just not what's going to happen.
Interesting. That's quite insightful. And just to take a step ahead into this only, what role do international relations play in shaping US's space policy from your perspective?
Well, the short answer is I would argue a lot. Um, the longer
Yeah.
answer is, and again, not to keep harping on this, but emphasizing the reason why the United States got into space was because of concerns about Soviet
Yes.
domination, and wish to
Yes.
demonstrate that the U.S. way of life and that capitalism and democracy was a better way of doing things than communism. So it has been, I guess, that type of competition has been shaping U.S. priorities for going on 5+ decades now, almost 6 decades, I guess. Um, but also it shapes kind of decision making. For example, I would point to the International Space Station, which has been
Yes.
I think um this hot take, scientifically it's been okay in terms of doing the experiments, and they've been able to accomplish some
Yes.
things, but really and truly I think the best thing it's done, and I think has not been emphasized enough, it's been a wonderful tool of diplomacy.
Right.
We have had people we, as in the International Space Station, governments, so have had people in space continuously for going on 24 years, which is a big deal. And it's built specifically. So there are two sides, the International Space Station. One is the Russian side, and one is the quote US side, but it's US, Canada, the European Space Agency, Japan. And the both sides need to work together to function, and that was done
Yes.
deliberately. And part of the reason why the U.S. and its allies decided to make the space station like that is, one, they wanted to tap into Russian experience with their
Yes.
space stations. The Russians had 3 space stations that they did during the Cold War, so they had a wealth of knowledge. But also there was concern post Soviet Union that their capabilities would go to the highest bidder, and so this is a way in which to, rein in those concerns and shape that. So you can see, international relations concerns were part of that, and then the International Space Station has been a great tool for diplomatic outreach, for bringing astronauts from other countries that are not members of the space station on board. So I think it's been very effective for that. But then also, when you're looking at international relations and how they shape US space programs, I mean, right now, I would say the biggest international relation topic or geopolitical concern, or whatever you want to look at
Yes.
it, is the US Chinese relationship.
Yes.
And that absolutely is shaping decisions that the United States makes for its civil space program, for its commercial space program, and absolutely its military space program. Not just what NASA is planning on doing, but looking at, after the National Space Station, NASA is looking at having commercial space station options. The Chinese have their space station going on right now. They were not allowed to be part of the National Space Station, so they built their own. So interestingly enough, their space station is going to be going on long after the ISS stops. Um, and there's been a lot of discussion about what the Chinese have been able to do in terms of lunar exploration, and what that means for their capabilities and the U.S.-Chinese relationship. So I think that definitely shapes that. U.S. decision making on its counter space R&D and capabilities is absolutely shaped by what they perceive the Chinese threat to be and what they believe the Chinese to be doing. And I would argue vice versa in that case. Um, so it definitely has a huge role in terms of, um, I won't say setting the priorities, but giving input to what sort of programs and vision the United States has for its space program.
Interesting. And I mean, you mentioned about the China factor as well, so it's great. So I'm coming, little by little to that point only. Can you provide examples of how the geopolitical tensions have affected the international space collaborations? Because I believe there have been one of the prime incident in the recent time was Russia-Ukraine war that we saw, and because of that, several collaborations were, kind of shattered. That they are no more in place, especially in Europe. Also, we have seen so from that perspective, can you give us some examples and a little bit, brief on how these tensions basically affect, in general, the space industry, its operations, and overall, the kind of the workforce that we have in the industry in terms of collaborations?
Sure. Yeah. So when Russia invaded Ukraine, most countries at that point decided to stop having Russia launch their satellites. Um, the Russian launch vehicles have been excellent. They are good workhorses. They were very reliable for the longest, for the better part of a decade, actually. They were the only way in which people could get up to the space station. And so a lot of countries were using Russia to launch their satellites, which, again, in the post-Cold War, it seemed like a good way to make your money go farther, having these international relationships, connect you with other countries, and so maybe it makes the possibility of conflict be less. But again, when Russia invaded Ukraine, a lot of countries were like, nope, not going to do that. A lot of they were actually launching satellites for commercial actors, and the commercial actors refused to bow down to the wishes of the Russians. I think the Russians in spring of 2022, they were saying, OneWeb, for example, they had a bunch of OneWeb satellites, and they said, okay, we will launch your satellites, but I think one of the conditions they made was that one would have to promise that the satellites wouldn't be used by any competitors of Russia. And one of them's like, come on, it's not going to happen. So
Yeah,
I don't even know if they ever got their satellites back, to be honest. So
yeah,
so that was an issue because launch capacity is always a concern. SpaceX at that point had been launching for a little while, but there's only so much they can do for their capacity, and so a lot of satellite operators were suddenly casting about looking for other launch options. And so that definitely had ripple effects going down the line in terms of whether satellites could get up, and just pushed everything back and, made things more complicated and more expensive to a certain extent. As well, the Europeans were going to be working with Russia on Mars exploration, the ExoMars program, and that got pulled out. So definitely, again, I think
yes,
there's just a concern about working with the Russians on these sort of capabilities, because of worries about technical cooperation, and then and that's complicated, other programs for exploration, right? Um,
yes,
One of the things that I find really interesting is that in 2021, China and Russia announced that they were starting their International Lunar Research Station program. And it was the idea that they were setting up a series of milestones of actions on the moon with the idea of eventually, within about 10 years, creating a lunar base. Um, and when they started it, it was, Russia and China. And it was very much like, yeah, we're going to work together. We encourage other countries to join us. But now, as we go further into the war, and Russia's having more and more problems with, funding, and they're having trouble with technologies because people are limiting what they can get access to, and their priorities are shifting towards more and more towards a conflict. The Chinese have started kind of downplaying the Russian role in the National Lunar Research Station, and frankly, at this point, I don't know how much extra capacity Russia would have to do this, which is a real shift. I mean, again, the Russians from the Cold War on were a geopolitical leader in space programs, and their relationship with China was almost like Russia was the major partner and China was the lesser partner, the junior partner. And I would argue now that's kind of switching, where China is becoming the primary partner and Russia, when they can contribute, is becoming the junior partner. And so that's, I think, shaping Chinese plans for the moon and, exploration and that sort of thing.
interesting. And just going again back to the actually the domestic politics and the administration part. So how do changes in US administration impact bilateral and multilateral space agreements? Because uh, as someone from the European region, we have always observed the fact that whenever there is a Republican administration that comes in, the space exploration, or something that is beyond the Earth orbit gets a much more preference. And when things are under the Democrats, I think the preference is more towards the terrestrial applications, through the space, of course, the satellite applications, which are helpful for the terrestrial purposes. So, from that perspective, can you just help us get more insights on, how things basically get impacted, and what the future basically looks like from your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I think that might have been the case in the past, but I think it's shifting a little bit because, again, I think the role of space is becoming more and more important just for US, in global people's daily lives. And so it's not just a factor of, okay, well, we're, going to cut out exploration. We're going to focus on, satellites for climate change monitoring, things like that. It's not an either or. I think it's a both. And one example I would give of that is the Artemis Accords, which is what the U.S. has been promoting via NASA and the State Department as a series of principles to identify, U.S. priorities for peaceful exploration on the moon and other celestial bodies as they go into that phase. And what it does is it pulls out principles from the Outer Space Treaty, and then talks about how they would apply to export more human space exploration, and then adds a few other things that are kind of specific to the moon, things like talking about deconfliction of activities, space resource use, cooperation, sharing of scientific research and data, that sort of thing. So which sounds like, if you were just to describe the program, it's like, oh, clearly a Democrat president came up with that. Not the case, actually.
Yeah.
That was started at the end of the Trump administration. A Republican, who I may emphasize as it was, and unfortunately still is a Republican. So yeah, that is not necessarily what you envision. And in fact, I know there were some concerns within the space community that when the Biden administration came in, they would be like, "Up, it's a Trump thing. We're just going to toss it because clearly it's no good." And a lot of people are like, "No,
Yeah.
no, this is actually helpful. Like you want to keep this. This is something, generally speaking, that is pretty good." And so, and the Biden administration has, and in fact, they've kind of leaned into it. They're still looking at the Artemis program, which is the idea that they'll get the first woman and first person of color on the moon. That has shifted back the date when that's going to happen by a couple of years. But to be honest, the Trump administration's announcement of that date was always wildly ambitious. So that doesn't surprise me. That's been shifted back a little bit. So yeah, so that is something. I think there is possibility for continuation for some things, right? And I think
Yeah.
civil space is probably the most obvious part. It's more things like space arms control, space diplomacy. I think that's where you may see a difference in terms of Republican or Democratic presidential administrations, both in terms of who they nominate to be ambassadors, at the Conference of Disarmament, at the CD, which is where a lot of these sort of like the security space negotiations take place. Um, so that may be an issue, particularly if you look, for example, the U.S. has been very involved in a series of discussions held at the United Nations, it's called an open-ended working group, trying to identify norms, rules, and principles of responsible behavior in space. The idea that you're looking at non-legally binding approaches, um, and you know, and that's been something that has been called for, within the U.S. government by other departments. DoD has been highly supportive of this tenets of responsible behavior. The Secretary of Defense came up with a memo on that in the summer of 2021. So this is not just, the Biden administration driving it. The United States announced 2 years ago it was making a commitment not to conduct destructive anti-satellite missile tests, just because the amount of debris that's created is dangerous and harm to the space environment. Um, but it's a unilateral declaration, right? U.S. is just saying, hey, we're
Yes.
going to do this ourselves. They've since been joined by 36 more countries, so 37 countries in total have made this commitment. There's a UN General Assembly resolution, supporting this a couple years ago, and 105 countries voted in support of it. So it's it's there, but these are all non-legally binding approaches, and that's a very long-winded way of building up to. If you look at Project 2025, which is what the Republicans have put forward in terms of their policy proposal for if Trump were to win re-election or get elected back into office, I guess I should say. Here's what they would do. And their space section, generally speaking, is, not too unexpected, but they're very specific that they're going to be not for space arms control. They're not going to be talking about norms behavior. They're not going to be about unilateral discussion. So it sounds like they would
Yes.
be against all that. Also, having said that, the Trump administration has kind of separated themselves a little bit from Project 2025. So who knows?
Yeah.
There's a lot of stuff there, but there's a possibility for there. So
Interesting.
yeah, I think that there are a lot of question marks, but it could have some effects.
Interesting. Yeah. I mean, I would like to now, kind of take a little bit jump ahead, as you mentioned about, all the government side of the aspect related to these things. And I believe when we speak about the government programs and the government initiatives, policies, the private sector is something that is very much involved these days in the space industry, not only in the US but in the other parts of the world as well. So, from your perspective, what will be the implications of US election outcomes on the private space sector?
Um, yeah, that's a good point. I think there will be continued support for the commercial sector with it, no matter who wins the presidential election. And this is part of partially because again, if you hear US military officials, for example, talk about, future space and space threats and space capabilities, and they always say the United States has two things in its favor that its rivals do not. One, international partnerships. Two, the U.S. commercial space sector. The U.S. military officials see the commercial space sector as a strong, I guess, resource that it can tap into in terms of providing capabilities that the U.S. government doesn't then need to build themselves. They can just pay the commercial sector for that. So, and I think if you look at, we have the Office of Space Commerce really trying to promote um, um, regulation
Yes.
of new activities, although they haven't quite gotten what's called mission authorization, which is the idea of regulating novel activities in space, but they're working on it. So I think that will continue to be in place, that, the U.S. commercial sector is going to continue to be supported, um, both in terms of ensuring continued U.S. leadership internationally, improving the U.S. economy through the space sector, and then using it as a bulwark against threats. So I think the U.S. commercial sector will be continued, and in terms of globally, I think it's there's a lot of I always talk about interwoven nature. I feel like I say that all the time. I talk about this, but really and truly, there is. When you have, and I would point out, for example, SpaceX launches a lot of satellites for U.S. entities and for non-U.S. entities. And for example, when the U.S. When SpaceX had an issue with launch last month, and they were temporarily grounded until they could figure out what the problem was and start launching again. I mean, basically, that just halted a lot of launches for a lot of satellites and a lot of programs, down the line. And so I think it really indicates how important the U.S. commercial space sector is providing those sort of capabilities. And I know when we talk about space, people often just focus on launch, but I would point out, a couple different ways in which U.S. commercial sector, I think, affects other economic sectors internationally. And that would be, through Earth observation. Commercial Earth observation has been a huge part of, there's been developing capabilities internationally. They've been, commercial operators have been a huge part of imaging during the Ukrainian war, and a lot of countries are starting to look at this as an option. One of the things I found really fascinating was how Ukrainians did a crowdfunding so they could buy a satellite to
Yes.
keep eye on Russians over the summer, which is wild. Can you imagine even just a year or two ago, like say, okay, we're just going to buy our own SAR satellite, and we're just going to keep an eye on it. Like
Yeah.
that wasn't even a possibility up until recently. So I think there's definitely consequences for that. And then as well, there's been a real increase in commercial space situational awareness, or SSA companies, that provide all sorts of interests and capabilities that can keep track of objects in orbit. That historically SSA was something that was just the providence of governments. The U.S. and Soviet Union developed these sensors back during the Cold War. Here we are looking at history again. But the idea was they were trying to keep track of ICBMs coming over the North Pole from the other person and of the other country. And as an aside, like, oh, and we're also able to keep track of, well, we're seeing objects in space. Okay, we'll start a catalog. So I kind of went from there. And then even within the past, I would say 10, 15 years or so, the idea of like a strong commercial SSA sector independent of the US government was hard to believe. The US government shares SSA data in terms of potential conjunctions or close approaches with everyone, all actors, not just US, not just governments, but any commercial, anyone who's launch a satellite, because of the idea that they need to provide this information for basic spaceflight safety. And so,
Yes.
it's interesting to see the commercial SSA providers coming up that can do more exquisite, boutique kind of SSA things like, either SSA from space, of space, looking at SSA for new activities, like, things like if you're doing on-orbit servicing or refueling or something like that of a satellite, you're gonna have different SSA needs than just being to make sure, your satellite doesn't crash into a piece of space debris. So that's been really interesting as well, because the sort of capabilities are shared with actors around the world, and I think they're building up industries elsewhere. So I think they're definitely, the support of the U.S. commercial sector has ripple effects globally.